no sooner had air travel slowly started up Thursday when authorities suddenly stopped it at New York's 3 main airports late in the afternoon. Officials picked up a total of 10 people in 2 separate groups, one at LaGuardia, the other at JFK Airport.
But there is more news, perhaps, well, indeed it seems likely, that there were more hijackings planned, hijackings for yesterday, and John Miller has details on those.
Charlie, that's exactly what federal authorities believe. They believe that 2 teams tried to infiltrate airport security.
And we said earlier, some of them had indications from their tickets that they were going to be on flights on Tuesday, so they could have been additional operations on Tuesday.
They were booked for Tuesday, so all indicators are whatever it was they were trying to do yesterday, they were supposed to do by plan on Tuesday. Yet, the minute airspace was reopened, they showed right back up at the airport and tried to get on flights.
Now, John, as we're going to find out in a moment, the American Airlines flight at Kennedy, where SWAT teams went on board and took 3 people off the plane and put them under arrest. That was a flight bound for Los Angeles, a West Coast flight, the same kind of flight, cross-country flight, 4 of which were hijacked on Tuesday. But you mentioned that one of the flights was at LaGuardia. For people who don't know, LaGuardia doesn't have long-range flights. Was it a flight that was going to stop somewhere on the way to the West Coast, or do you know what that flight was?
I believe that flight was to San Jose, and LaGuardia doesn't have international flights, but they do have coast-to-coast flights.
Do they?
Yeah.
I didn't realize. Okay.
Let me ask you this, though, the big question. As you're talking to all the sources, and you have phenomenal sources on this, as we know, are they saying to you, this is not over? There are more of them out there. Stand by. Anything could happen any moment?
Yesterday, before this, they were indicating to me that based on the materials they'd gone through, the names, the associations they made, they felt that they had a universe of 40 potential hijackers. Now, you had 18 involved with these first 4 flights, 10 yesterday. By their math, that leaves the potential that there are 10 more. That would have added up, if you sparse the teams evenly, to 8 flights. So
Notice that even John Miller is alluding that there was a potential for a range of 8 hijacked flights on 9/11.
Up if you sparse the teams evenly to 8 flights. So we had 4, then the indicators that there was an attempt to bring that to 6. So they're really still on a very high alert, and the watch list that kicked in at Kennedy and LaGuardia yesterday, of course, are now in the possession of every airport in the country.
As already the story about the suspects carrying weapons between the 2 New York airports had already been removed by government officials, here is Jim Stewart in an effort already attempting to marginalize the incidents, detailing that they have not been charged for any crime, contrary to early reports that at least 1 person is arrested.
Good morning, Jane. The real news here this morning is that there have been no arrests, despite reports throughout the night that groups of people have been taken into custody in connection with Tuesday's attack apparently are unfounded. There have been no arrests as yet for anyone directly believed involved in Tuesday's attack. We need to also clear up some reports here that there have been another attempted hijacking at New York's JFK airport. There were published reports that 2 groups of men attempted to hijack an aircraft there last night. That is not true. There were reports that men armed with knives were caught on board aircraft at John F. Kennedy Airport. That is not true. What we are told is that at least 1 man is in custody, perhaps as many as 10 others are being questioned, and what they are in violation of could range from anything from INS violations to fake identities, any number of things, but I don't sense anyone believing that they are directly involved with Tuesday's attack.
Now this becomes the last appearance of Jim Hunter, who witnessed some of the arrests at JFK.
And eventually, after about 2 hours, the captain came through on the PA and then through the airplane, and he was spending a lot of time focusing very heavily on people's cell phones and electrical devices and those types of things, and personally saying that he was going to start confiscating them if people didn't put them away.
It's unusual for the captain to be doing that.
Yeah, especially when the door of the airplane is still open. Most people that fly a lot know that when you're at the gate, the door is still open, you can continue to use cell phones, generally. But he was being adamant about it, and we thought new security precautions, put the phones away. And eventually he came through my part of the cabin. He was talking to me and a few other passengers right around me, and he had at that point confiscated some high-tech headphones, like noise reduction headphones, that looked like to me from a woman that was sitting in front of me. And right around that same time, he came back and he said, he was just talking. And one of his first officer had come back and demanded that he go to the front. That it was urgent, that he needed to go to the front of the airplane. And one of the other passengers said, "Well, maybe that's good news." And the first officer said, "No, it's not good news," or sort of shook his head. But the odd thing was, 2 minutes later, the captain came on and he says, "Good news is we're going to the West Coast." And we're all thinking, great, we're headed home. And so get in your seats, buckle up, and we'll be ready to go in just a few minutes. We all got in our seats, and about 20 minutes later, we're wondering what's going on. Then suddenly there was a commotion behind us as the police had stormed in from the back of the airplane and had converged on right around row 19 of the plane, which was a few rows behind me, to basically secure a passenger that was back there. There was a lot of yelling and screaming and kicking as I looked around, and
yelling. The passenger yelling in English, or
no, not in English. And he was definitely a foreigner.
Did he resist?
He was absolutely resisting. He was kicking. He was screaming. He was very unhappy with the situation, obviously, based on what I was seeing. But I also turned around back to the front pretty quickly, because right at that point there were 15, 20 additional police officers coming at us in full SWAT gear with the helmets on and the rifles and pistols and the whole 9 yards, and trying to secure the airplane as quickly as possible. And there was a gentleman that was in row 8 right in front of me that they took into custody as well. And the woman with the headphones that was in front of me, one of the other passengers pointed out that she had actually boarded the plane with the other gentleman that they took into custody. He did not resist. He went very quietly. But they took her into custody as well. So I saw in 3 that they took 3 people into custody.
10 people were taken into police custody in New York's 2 major airports on Thursday.
The latest coming from New York airports is that there have been 10 people, approximately 10 people arrested at the airports. At LaGuardia Airport, there have been 5 to 6 people arrested, and at JFK Airport, there have been 3 to 4 people arrested, and one of them is a woman. These people have been reported to carry knives and flying manuals and false IDs, and at least one man, had tried to get on an airplane using a false ID of a pilot. Now, these people have been questioned by authority, and they are suspected of trying to carry out another hijack activity. When one of the New York reporters, local TV station reporters, interviewed an Israeli man stranded at JFK Airport waiting to go home to Israel, the young Israeli said on TV, "Now the Americans can finally feel what we have always felt like." And a man sitting next to me watching this TV, an American man said, "Well, if not for you, we wouldn't have to feel this way."
Jim Olsen was on one of those planes, and when it was stormed by SWAT teams. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Katie. And next thing you know, there was just a loud voice that said, "Everyone down," and you could just hear these really stormtroopers or SWAT team members just running down both aisles with guns, in hand.
It must have been pretty terrifying.
Yeah, it was surreal. I mean, it was, on the one hand, you sort of felt like you were an extra in a bad movie, but then at the same time, it was surreal. You didn't really know what to think, and then it finally sort of hit you that these were potentially terrorists that were on your flight, and it finally you finally realize it finally touches you, or this whole event reaches out to anyone, not just folks who live in New York.
Couple of other pieces of news.
Overnight, 2 more raids by the FBI of motels in the Deerfield Beach area, and then late last night, the Florida Highway Patrol put out an all-points bulletin in connection with the terrorist case to look for 7 Arab men in 2 different Lincoln Town Cars that were rented in Fort Myers, Florida, one way headed for New York City.
Lincoln Town Cars headed for New York. Okay, thanks, Brian.
But it does sound like at the New York airports, they got some of these guys last night when they raided this plane. The worry is they don't know how many more they don't have.
This also becomes the last appearance of Jim Olsen.
An American Airlines flight out of Kennedy Airport. Jim Olsen, who joins us now live this morning. Jim, good morning to you. What exactly did you see?
Well, it all happened very fast. I looked over my shoulder, and there were half a dozen FBI SWAT team members standing there, and within probably about 2 seconds, they ordered us to put our heads down in a crash position, and they stormed through the plane, and we could hear them dragging out at least one person, and I learned later that it was probably about 3 people that they ended up taking out.
Was there any resistance that you could tell, and what language was being used?
Well, you could definitely hear, I heard at least one distinctive male voice. I don't want to really speculate on the ethnicity of it, but it was clearly not English.
And Jim, this was all happening on the plane, and how long had you been on that plane?
We had been sitting on the plane for probably a good 3.5 hours at that point.
And were you wondering what was going on?
Oh, certainly. I think there was a high level of anticipation and actually excitement, because the last we had heard from the pilot was that we had a clear for pushback from the gate. And we basically at that point sat at the gate for another 15 minutes, and then they burst through the back door.
Look, Jim, you know what might have almost happened to your plane flight and your plane. I mean, this was a plane that was supposed to take off apparently on Tuesday, and it was canceled when all air traffic was grounded after the first attacks. I mean, it may very well have been that yesterday yet another terrorist attack was foiled, and you were right in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I didn't get much sleep last night, and but I think it is. I think that at least in this case, the security measures they had in place worked. So I think that should be commended.
Look, you've been trying to get back to Los Angeles the last 3 or 4 days, as I understand it. You going to try to fly back to Los Angeles in the next few days, or you maybe thinking about a train?
I don't know if you can get a train ticket for me right now. I'm just trying to get back any way I can. I'm eager to get home.
Additional details have just emerged. We've had access to someone who has been over an extensive debriefing of one of the crew on that plane. And according to the member of the crew, they were all gathered in the waiting area to board the flight. There were airline employees flying non-revenue, deadheading they call it, just taking the plane back to their base in LAX. There was also an individual there who had an LAX ID card. They didn't have enough crew to fill out the plane, so they were asking some of the crew members who were off duty if they would work the flight, and most of them just said that they were just too exhausted to do it and too emotionally unprepared because of what they'd been through because of the deaths of their friends on the other plane. And at that point, they say, this gentleman stepped forward, flashed an LAX ID card and said, well, I'll crew this flight. I work on the LA end. And the LAX people didn't recognize him. They thought it was odd, but not so much at the time. And eventually, enough crew did show up, and then he was given a passenger seat instead of a crew seat. But then it turns out when a SWAT team stormed the plane, and the FBI agents moved in and identified the people that they suspected as hijackers and associates of the other hijackers, this gentleman was one of them. So an indication that among the false IDs he was carrying, there was a false ID of an airline crew employee, and that he was attempting to take a position on the plane where he might have access to the cockpit and essentially the run of the ship.
And add to that the earlier reports that we had that possibly they had some flight attendant uniforms from someplace.
Right, and that was from another airport, and those people were later released. But again, it's a sign of how jittery people are across the country. But this kind of underscores the idea that there was a very active effort yesterday. When this guy saw an opportunity, if the details of this debriefing show that he was trying to get special access to the plane, which would have been an advantage to a hijacker.
At New York's LaGuardia airport, this was just one of the arrests. At least one was reportedly carrying a fake pilot's license. Some apparently had penknives.
And around 8:42 a.m. on the morning of September 14th, MSNBC begins a domino effect, retracting all the stories suggesting that the arrests at the airports were not foiled hijacking attempts, but instead manifesting into suspects allegedly attempting to flee the country. So instead of bringing any clarity, the media attempts to assert that it's all clear. Nothing to see here, folks. Without any communique explaining how such misreporting could be so detailed and not have happened.
We can now say that the crisis has passed. at New York's 3 airports, Newark, LaGuardia, and JFK, which were very abruptly shut down yesterday afternoon after a series of, we can now say, remarkable coincidences that caused officials there to overreact. It's probably safe to say, but it's probably also safe to say understandably overreact given the situation. Now, here is what we now know. 2 separate incidents, unrelated, but both oddly coincidental. In the first incident, a man who is an actual legitimate pilot boarded an airplane, tried to board an airplane. They checked his identification. Everything was fine, but he also was carrying identification for his brother. I'm not sure why, but he was carrying an ID for his brother. Now, here's where the odd coincidence comes in. That brother at one time lived at a Boston address, which was also at one time the address for some suspected associates of known terrorists. So that set off all kinds of alarms. Then, shortly after that, 9 other people, so we're dealing with a total of 10 people here, 2 separate incidents. 9 other people try to board an airplane with stickers or tags on their luggage that strike airport officials as odd, because they think that these people are trying to masquerade as airline employees, when in fact, it turns out, these people were all legitimate passengers who were trying to go to a conference put on by the Boeing Corporation. Boeing, of course, the big jet manufacturer, made the 2 jets that were involved, the 2 kinds of jets that were involved in Tuesday's suicide crashes, the 757 and 767. You put all this together, an ID issue, the people that it appears to airline employees are trying to masquerade as airline employees. That's what the airport officials think. They blow the whistles, they shut down the airport, they question these people extensively, but now they're satisfied it was all a false alarm, and as I say, an overreaction, but an understandable one. This may not be the last of this, but they're satisfied that the situation at JFK and LaGuardia is now totally resolved. There were no weapons. They're satisfied now, they say, that this was not an attempt to hijack these planes.
And just in the nick of time to add to it, Joe Biden attempts to discredit all the reports from JFK and LaGuardia, as he already first attempted to yesterday evening.
A very powerful, very well-known senator, Senator Joseph Biden from Delaware. I want to talk to you about a few things. You are the chairperson of the Foreign Relations Committee, so you have a lot of information about what's been going on. First, let's start with what happened in New York. There have been a lot of reports overnight last night about some detained people in New York at the airport. Tell us what you know.
What I know is to be factual, and last night I couldn't say this on air. Those people have no connection whatsoever to what happened at the World Trade Towers or the Pentagon or this organization and network. 2 things happened, Kate. One guy, an actual pilot, got on the plane, coincidentally had his brother's identification as well. His brother happened to live in an apartment complex that was one in Boston where some of these people had actually been. Totally coincidental. 10 other people were going to a Boeing conference. They had stickers on their bags. They worked for Boeing or were invited by Boeing. I'm not sure the detail. The folks at the airport thought, hey, wait a minute, are they impersonating crew? And they weren't. One guy was arrested and detained, and it was a screwball who was acting out. Was acting out, just saying and demanding. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing, demanding to get on, making problems, and they arrested him. All the rest of these people have been released. There is no connection whatsoever. Now, what happened was, because we're all on such high alert here, they closed down all those airports until they knew that was the case.
But you're confident that that's the case?
I'm confident that I've spoken to the director of the FBI, the number 2 guy. I've spoken to the CIA and George Tenet. This was 6 o'clock this morning, as late as 6:30 this morning, which is an hour and a half ago, or whatever.
What about other leads and other, there have been many other, we've been reporting many other places where investigations are underway.
Well, there are.
Florida.
Kate, there are, and there will be other people arrested. These guys didn't operate alone. Last night when I was responding to another program, was I aware of what was going on, I thought they were talking about investigations of baggage handlers, of people at airports, etc. That is thoroughly, we have 7,000 FBI agents out there combing the countryside, and you will see other arrests. released. But one thing people should understand, there is no evidence that there were people trying to get on a plane to duplicate what happened at the Pentagon or in Pennsylvania or in the state of New York.
Is there evidence that there could be more to come? Do you have a sense for that?
I'm not at liberty to speak to that except to say people should not be, I understand their fear, but people should not be fearful that there's an imminent prospect of a similar event occurring. We're going to get all kinds of threats, Kate.
Let me go back to the investigation just for a moment, since you do know so much. What can you tell us about whether these were cells of people who knew each other, who didn't know each other? Do you have any sense for how big an organization we're talking about?
Let me be careful here. We have evidence that there were a number of cells, all knowing one another, all in part of the game plan, that were able to pull off this god-awful event. I think in the next days, Kate, you'll see some very concrete evidence of that presented to the American people.
Will we see a declaration from this Congress tomorrow declaring support for force?
What you may see is as early as today.
At earliest today?
You may see it as early as today,
okay,
Kate.
Thank you,
I'm
Senator.
going in to present it now.
And just after 2 hours of ABC's Good Morning America, not only opening with detailed coverage about the incidents most thorough at JFK and LaGuardia with John Miller, as well as having gone the lengths of bringing a witness in studio, Miller unenthusiastically follows protocol with also retracting the stories at the airports.
Well, last night we heard the news that there had been some detaining, at least, arrests of people, pulling people in from airplanes. The alarm went out. Everybody concerned the potential hijackings, additional hijackings had been foiled. And John Miller has some news on that front right now.
And some very relieving news. Federal authorities say after investigating the stories of the people that they arrested last night, they've been able to release most of them. Out of the 4 taken into custody at Kennedy Airport, they've released 3. One is still being held for further investigation. Now, what federal authorities are saying is that so many of their alarm bells went off last night that they felt it was imperative to storm the airplane with a SWAT team to take these people into custody and to order all flights in and out of New York shut down while they sorted out what they believed was 2 attempted hijackings. Now they say after a night of investigation, the confusion stemmed from the false ID. They've established that one man was using his brother's identification, the man who was claiming to be a pilot. Also, one of the individuals lived at an address in Boston that showed up in the FBI's database as the address of another suspected terrorist. The 4 men at LaGuardia Airport, whose luggage was marked as if they were members of an airline crew, have told a story that they were on their way to a conference of airline manufacturers, and they've been able to corroborate some of that. So what they're now saying is what appeared to them to be 2 attempted hijackings and 2 groups of terrorists may now have checked out to be a series of extremely unlikely coincidences at a time when they were geared up to be extremely careful. So they're still sorting through this.
So is there any way of knowing if this is an all clear, or is this just insufficient evidence?
Well, it's a balancing act. It seems that they certainly wouldn't have gone so far as to release 3 of the 4 people at Kennedy Airport, although some of the law enforcement people I spoke to today even were frustrated and felt that required more investigation. But they're still of the opinion that they don't know who all the players are. They're still operating with a list of 52 other people. And, I mean, the level of coincidence, the fact that some of them had been in Florida, that some of them had taken flight training at the same school, are the kinds of things that it was just too much at once for them last night to not shut down the airspace, to not hold these people. I mean, they were taken away in handcuffs. They were under arrest. They were not free to go, but ultimately not charged because, as bizarre as it sounds, despite the terrorist connection to one of their addresses, the fact that one was using identification which was not his own, although it does check out now to be his brother's, despite that series of coincidences, much of what they say has been able to be corroborated to the extent that authorities believe they don't have enough to charge them with anything.
For those of us here in New York, it was one of the scariest things we could have ever heard. As it turns out, those reports were simply false. What happened? Well, apparently, there were just a number of coincidences. Senator Joseph Biden was on the Today Show talking about this about half an hour ago.
The reports this morning are erroneous in terms of who was arrested, what they had in their possession, and why they were arrested. I've spoken at length with the FBI and the CIA, and the truth of the matter is there were no box cutters, there were no knives. What happened was there were people who were now doing the right thing. We're checking the name and the bag and the name of the bag. Anybody didn't have the same, that doesn't mesh, then they get pulled off a flight. We now are doing things relating to the backgrounds on people who are on planes. We pull people off of planes. The one guy that got arrested is a guy who was acting out, some screwball who was acting out, but he did not possess knives or box cutters or any of those.
There was nobody.
Let's bring back in John Miller because we want the very latest on the arrests that were made yesterday, the releases that have taken place now.
That's right. Federal authorities are actually giving us some very comforting news last night, having set off alarm bells that they felt that there were two hijacking teams about to hijack two new planes, separate arrests at LaGuardia and Kennedy Airport. After questioning these people through the night, they've released, as far as we have it, all but one of them, and they just want to go over some more details with the last man about some other issues. But it's a chain reaction of confusing events that you almost couldn't recreate if you had to. When they get to the airport, one guy shows up, and airline counter people feel that they recognize them as people who tried to fly on Tuesday. The names don't match, but they believe that these are the same group that tried to fly on Tuesday, the day that planes were crashed into the buildings. So they alert authorities. Then when they investigate one of these individuals, he has identification, and he says he's a pilot. But when they examine his pilot identification, it's under a different name. Now they have a man with multiple identities who the airline people are suspicious of. That against the backdrop of later, when they're on higher alert, 4 men at LaGuardia show up with baggage that identifies them as part of an airline crew. So one thing led to another, Of course, some of these people had already boarded the plane in the case of Kennedy Airport, which was stormed by a Port Authority police SWAT team backed up by FBI agents from the terrorist task force, who arrested 2 men and a woman and questioned them through the night.
But a couple of things so that we don't leave people alarmed. They were indicating to you, authorities were early on in the night, that they thought they had foiled a couple of more hijackings. They no longer believe that because they've let these people go.
They believed last night, when they conducted these raids, handcuffed these people and took them into custody, that they had 2 additional cells of people who were going to use the same MO, again because of the false identification, the claims of being airline personnel, and the fact that they were together but sat separately in different parts of the aircraft. All of this made them very suspicious. And the statements of airline employees who were suspicious.
Here's the mayor now of New York City to start his news conference.
The misinformation yesterday was a cause of real concern.